How's it going, everyone? It's a great honor to present to you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Larry Schechter. He is the author of more than one book, Winning Fantasy Baseball, but the one that we're gonna talk about is called The History of Fantasy Sports. So, Larry, thank you for joining. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
For sure, for sure. Well, first things first, Larry. I said this before we started recording, but I'm gonna say it again. Congratulations on all of your success. Um, this book, I haven't read the first one yet, Winning Fantasy Baseball, but the second one, the history of fantasy sports, very exciting, intriguing book. And it grabbed me right from the beginning, which is the preface, which I'm gonna ask you a few questions about that.
hmm
But the first thing I want to ask you is, what was the inspiration for you to write a second book?
Okay. Well, the first book, Winning Fantasy Baseball, was 10 years ago. I wrote that, actually 11 years ago now. And that is about strategy, how to play fantasy baseball. So unless you probably would not want to read that book. I would not recommend you read that book. That's a good book for people who play fantasy baseball, and the strategy also applies to other fantasy sports, but that's like a special thing that not everybody would want to read. My new book, The History of Fantasy Sports, is completely different. Now, to answer your question, what happened is after I wrote the first book, I would sometimes ask myself if I had any ideas for another book. And this was the only idea I ever had that was any good because, I've played fantasy sports since the early 1990s. And, back then things were completely different. And I over the years, I would, things changed. And by the, 2020 or whatever, after I'd written my first book, I would look around at the fantasy landscape, and you've got millions and millions of people playing fantasy sports all over the world. Everything from fantasy baseball, fantasy football to fantasy Iditarod, fantasy cricket. It's like fantasy everything. You got 24/7 Sirius XM radio station. You got hundreds of fantasy experts. When you turn on a professional game, you got fantasy statistics. I mean, it's crazy. And so I would just, for several years look around and go, how did this all happen? How did we go from some ideas people had years ago for games to where we are now with this worldwide phenomenon? And I thought somebody should write a book about this. Nobody, there's never been a book like this. Nobody's ever explained how this all happened. So that's where I got the idea.
Awesome, awesome stuff. But when I started reading the preface of this book, The History of Fantasy Sports, you did a good job, in my opinion, in the sense of that you showed vulnerability and what you were going through from a health situation. Because one thing for sure, Larry, is that yes, we love what we do. We like to write, we like to grind and put in work, but sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in an instant we could slip our minds that we forget about how important our health is. So health is number one priority. I preach on that. And let me just, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend it. And I'm gonna say that more than once on this interview, but I'm gonna read a little bit of this preface that you wrote here. On April 30th, 2022, I had a heart attack. I ended up on a ventilator for 5 days. I spent my 64th birthday on a ventilator. And I'm gonna leave it right there. How was that moment like for you and your family? What were you going through knowing that, okay, you just wrote this book that came out in 2014, and now you're in a life and death situation here? And although I'm a person that I believe that you should celebrate and treat your birthday like it's every single day, but again, I know that everybody's opinion is different. But the fact that you had to spend your birthday on a ventilator, how was that moment like for you? How tough was it for you and your family? And did that situation give you much more motivation to write the second book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I didn't know I was on a ventilator on my birthday. I was on a ventilator for about 4 days or so, and most of that time I was unconscious, and I had no idea I was on a ventilator. And then there came a time where I became consciously aware that I was on the ventilator. And this is actually continued. If you read the rest, if you the rest of the preface, most of this is in there. That there became a time I was consciously aware that I was on a ventilator and my life was in grave danger. And when I that happened, the thoughts went through my head like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe I might die. I'm too young to die. I want to spend more time with my kids. I want to marry my current girlfriend. I want to travel more. These thoughts went through my head. And then the other thought that went through my head was I should have written that book, referring to the history of this fantasy sports book, because I had been planning on doing it, but I had never done it. And it was interesting that, potentially on my deathbed and all these, things I would regret or wanted to live for, it was kind of interesting that, I should have written that book would go through my head. And that's what inspired me once I recovered, which obviously I recovered. Um, I decided, okay, when I'm healthy enough, I'm going to write the book. And I did. And it was a lot of work. Turned out to be a lot more than I ever imagined. I thought it was something I could knock off in 3 or 4 months. That was crazy wrong. It took 18 months of full-time work, researching, interviewing dozens of people. But it was worth it because the book turned out fantastic. And, just to quickly answer the other part of your question about my family, they thought, yeah, it didn't look good. When I was on the ventilator, the doctors they were not optimistic at all. So my recovery was really classified as a miracle.
Well, Larry, I'm glad that you're still here with us. I'm glad that that you're still here, that you were able to see, that you were able to finish this book, and now many people have read it. I'm pretty sure you got a lot of support. So, but hey, no, like I said, health is number one priority, and I'm glad that you're still here with us.
Yep, me too. And my family
So,
also. Yep.
and I also want to thank you, Larry, because although I'm a person that I've been following sports for 25, 26 years, but when it comes to sports betting, fantasy sports, I'm not I would say the most knowledgeable or the biggest fan when it comes to that
hmm
situation. But at the same time, I'm a person that I'm willing to hear other people's voice, other people's opinions, so they could, you know, teach me and show me exactly the ins and outs of that. So, and I feel like that's important for every human being, that whether you agree or disagree or something that it's out of your comfort zone or your comfort zone, it's good to hear other people's opinions, whether it's through a book, podcast, the list goes on and on. And reading this book, I was learning a lot from the beginning, early chapters. And this is definitely one of those books, even though I have it on Kindle at the moment, but it's one of those materials that I will have to like read it over and over and over to
hmm
familiarize myself. So I thank you on that because you really took me on a history journey, going back to like the 30s, 40s, etc.
Right.
So my question to you is actually, I'm gonna ask this one first. What was the most out of all the chapters? What was the most challenging chapter that you've written, and what's the most exciting part of this book that you felt that you were excited to write about? So I would say, what was the most challenging chapter, and what was the
Yeah.
most exciting chapter of this book?
Okay. Well, first of all, for people who are listening to this and don't know anything about the book, let me just explain that like I mentioned before, my first book, Wayne Fantasy Baseball, that's for people who play fantasy baseball primarily. And, anybody else, there's really no reason to want to read that book. But this book, The History of Fantasy Sports, now that's the name of the book. The subtitle is "And the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen." Because what happened when I started to research the book, I started out with, it's going to be the history of fantasy sports. How did it all happen? Who did what when? And when I started interviewing and researching, I started to hear really, really interesting stories and, fascinating stories, inspirational stories, a lot of funny stories about what people did. And I realized early on that I could just write the history of fantasy sports, who did what when, how did it all happen, and I would get the job done. And it would also come off as a very boring research paper or Wikipedia entry, but by telling the stories that I was hearing of what people did would make the book easy to read and very interesting and easy to read rather than a boring research paper. So that's where I got the subtitle of the book, the stories of the people who made it happen. And so anybody can read this book and like it, even if you've never played fantasy sports, because it's not about how to play fantasy sports or strategy. It's the stories of the people, the entrepreneurs, what they did. So, like, for example, the Midwest Book Review did a book review by someone who's never played fantasy sports, and the review says fascinating from start to finish. So that's why someone like you or anyone, whether or not you've played fantasy sports, will find the stories really interesting. And then to get to your question, the a lot of it was really challenging because I'm like trying to research a lot of things that happened years ago, talking to people, asking them, about things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. And most people have a hard time remembering what they had for lunch yesterday, let alone something happened 40 years ago. So that was challenging. And I would sometimes get conflicting information from different sources and had to try to figure out what's really true. Um, and Yeah, so a lot of it was very challenging, and a lot of it though was really fascinating, as I said before, because like it turned out to be 18 months of full-time work, which I had no idea what I was getting into. And what kept me going all those months is because I kept hearing and learning all this stuff where I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. And nobody knows this stuff. Like, 99% of the stuff people don't even know what happened or who did what. And even people who've been in the fantasy sports industry their entire life or been played fantasy sports for years and years don't know most of this stuff. So that kept me going because I knew, oh my God, this is going to be great. And it is, the reviews have been fantastic.
And that leads me to a follow question. Out of many people that have written to you, that have talked to you about the book, what was the most impactful comment that you received about this book so far?
Well, I guess if I had to put, I'll give you two. I just really referred to them. I mean, the Midwest Book Review saying fascinating from start to finish by someone who's never played fantasy sports. You know, that's a great review. And the other one, which I just mentioned, the people have been in the industry their whole life. Paul Charchian um, has been in the fantasy sports industry for many, many years. He was the president of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association for 12 years. And he read it, and he said, I've never heard of most of this stuff, and it was enlightening. So, if I had to pick two, those would be the two.
Interesting, interesting. Larry, I want to play a little game with you to make this interview much more exciting. So are
All
you
right.
ready?
Uh-huh. Well, I don't know what kind of game it's going to be, but okay.
Oh, we'll keep it simple. Don't worry about it. So the first one that I'm gonna throw out there, what's your favorite breakfast meal?
Breakfast meal?
Yeah, what's your favorite breakfast meal?
Egg McMuffin meal.
Okay, okay. Name me at least two skill sets that you wish you would have
Dancing
had.
and better athlete.
In terms of dancing, which one particularly? What type of dancing?
Any dancing, just
Any dancing?
having some rhythm.
Okay.
Well, and I mean, not break dancing, but just general, anything.
And you mentioned athlete. Which sport in particular?
Well, I mean, I play golf. Um, I'm pretty good at golf, but it would be nice to have been, like really good at baseball, or be nice to be a better golfer. You know,
From 1 through 10, how good is your golf game?
that's a two-part question. Compared to the average golfer, my golf game is probably like an 8. but compared to people who are good, it's like a zero. It's like golf is it's interesting. I mean, you can be a pretty good golfer and be you're better than 80% of the people who play golf or 90% of the people who play golf. But then when you compare yourself to people who are really good at golf, and I don't mean just pros, but even good amateurs, I mean it's like you're not even close to that good.
I've grown to love and appreciate golf in the last 2, 3 years, and I first started playing golf, just for the fun of it back in 2021. And I thought to myself, golf is not boring. I don't know why for so many years I thought that golf was boring, but when I played it, I had
Mhm.
fun.
Yeah.
And now that I'm following golf consistently since 2023, I don't miss any single event. I stay tuned everything that's going on in the golf world. And I am planning in the future to take golf lessons because I really want to practice and play more often. And hey, practice makes everything perfect.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I've grown to appreciate golf.
Well,
It takes
that'll
a
give
lot of
you
focus, a lot of things goes into that.
yeah, that'll give you another reason to move to Florida someday, because then you can play golf year round. In Manhattan, you can't play year round. I live in Florida now, but I'm originally from upstate New York. I lived in upstate New York and Boston my whole life until about 10 years ago. And it's amazing to just be in Florida and just not have to deal with the winter and play golf year round.
Have you been to any golf events like Augusta, or have you been to any of them?
You know, like pro tournaments?
Not to play, but like to go as a
Yeah, it's
customer, as an audience.
yeah. No, I went to one practice round of the US Open years ago. That's all. But I mean,
Oh,
I watched some of it on TV, obviously.
all right. Well, I have two more questions for this for to conclude this game. What are your top three? No, I would say what are your top five favorite authors?
I don't know to pass on that. I'd have to think about that for a while.
Okay, all right. So that leads me to the final one then. Name me at least five people that are dead or alive that you would like to have a sit down and have a conversation with. Pick their brain about anything.
Huh.
That shouldn't
Okay.
be difficult. I mean, there's so many, but you could just throw any
Uh,
names out there.
Five people, dead or alive. Oh boy. All right, just the first ones that come to mind. I'm going to say Barack Obama, Donald Trump, um, Muhammad Ali, um, hmm, my my parents. They're my parents are dead. Nice to have one more conversation with them. And the last one, I got to pick. I'm thinking I got to pick like a supermodel or someone, but I won't name anyone specifically. I'll just leave it at that.
Hmm. What about, I mean, what about in baseball? I'll give
Like
you that
like I
idea
got
in baseball.
like I got a chance of getting your phone number. What baseball?
Yeah, if we could name one more person out of that list,
All right,
at least in baseball, who would it be?
Pedro Martinez.
Oh, nice, nice. Well, those are good options. You mentioned that. I love the fact that you mentioned your parents because I asked the question just in general. It could be anyone. So the fact that you
Yeah.
mentioned your parents, I like that. Um, I mean, I always tell people if your parents are still alive, call them. Don't text, don't email, call
hmm
them. That's
hmm
the better way. I'm fortunate that my parents are still alive. So, and I feel like many of us we tend to forget or not fully appreciate the people that are still around. But when it comes to your parents and your kids, I mean, yes, your brothers and sisters, uncles, aunts, etc., they're all important, but it's a different level of pain when you lose a kid or when you lose a parent. But if your parents are still alive, you gotta value them. So I love the fact that you mentioned your parents on that list. And And yes, Muhammad Ali also, of course, the great one. We can't forget about the great one.
Yeah.
And the impact that he made in sports was humongous. But yeah, that concludes the game. Good job, Larry. And last but not least, actually, no, I have two more. Number one, is there any other book that you have in mind that you have planned to write in the future?
No,
Or
no, this is it. This is it.
is it?
The last one. Yeah. It's available paperback and ebook on most booksellers' websites. Amazon is the easiest place to get it and to see all the details and all the reviews of what's in it. But no, this is my last book.
Okay, well, I respect that, Larry. And number two, final question, where can we follow you and your work?
Twitter, my name, Larry Schechter, LarrySchechter. That's the main place. But the main way to follow my work is, get the history of fantasy sports and read it. Anybody who plays fantasy sports will definitely love it. It's a great gift if you know somebody who plays fantasy football or other fantasy sports. It makes a great gift. And even people just, as I said before, people who've never played it before have mostly really liked the book because of the stories in it.
Yeah, I think this book is definitely for everyone that loves sports, whether they are familiar with fantasy sports or not, whether they play it or not. So once again, Larry, thank you. Thank you so much for blessing us with this book. Like I said, I have it on Kindle, and you grabbed me right from the beginning with the preface and taking us through this historical journey. So thank you once again for writing this magnificent book. And guys, for those of you who will be watching this again, I didn't want to give away too much because you guys have to read it and see for yourself and give your own opinion on the book. But it's called The History of Fantasy Sports. You could get it on Amazon. There's Kindle and there's the paperback. So I highly recommend it. I enjoyed it, and I'm pretty sure many other people that have written to Larry have enjoyed it as well. So I highly recommend. This is definitely a great source of material for all of us who have a passion for sports and appreciate the history of sports. So, Larry, thank you once again. Like I said, I'm glad that you're still here with us. And because without health, we can't do anything. And I wish you many more years of great health. And I'm sure your family is very proud of you.
Yep. Thank you.